Hi, this is Andy. If you're listening to this episode close to when it's released, you know that it's an election year in the United States and many other countries as well. And each time an election comes around, it just seems like people lose their mind. I mean, the fights on broadcast and social media and between families and friends just seems to be more toxic and polarizing than ever before. But it's not just an issue in election years, or for that matter, regarding politics and social issues. I mean, many of us face opportunities for challenging discussions at work on a regular basis. Maybe it's between team members or between us and other project stakeholders. Whether at work or outside, it just seems to me that we're losing our ability to have healthy dialogues. I'm excited to introduce you today to Stephen T. Collis, a law professor at the University of Texas Austin School of Law and founding faculty director of UT's First Amendment Center. Now, I could tell you more about his credentials, but let me say it this way. Stephen is a guy who is deeply engaged in how to have healthier dialogues, even when they're on difficult topics. He's put those ideas into a practical and very accessible new book entitled Habits of a Peacemaker: 10 Habits to Change Our Potentially Toxic Conversations into Healthy Dialogues. In today's discussion, Stephen will make it clear what it means to be a peacemaker. And by the way, what it doesn't mean. We'll talk about some of the habits mentioned in the book, and we'll use some scenarios that I think you'll be able to relate to. And before we're done, you'll be introduced to many practical ideas you'll be able to apply right away to potentially toxic conversations that you face. And you'll see why I consider this to be a must read book for all of us. I can't wait to share the discussion with you. Hey, quick note, I want to invite you to join our Lead 52 family. It's a global group of leaders who are committed to transforming our ability to lead and deliver. It's 52 weeks of leadership learning delivered right to your inbox, taking less than 5 minutes a week. It's all for free. Learn more and sign up at getlead52.com. Thanks. Let's jump into today's discussion with Stephen about his new book, Habits of a Peacemaker. Hey, Stephen, thank you for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Andy, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. We'll talk about ideas from the book, but I'd like to start with you, for better or for worse, because sometimes people tell me their research is me search. So, how would you describe your family culture growing up when it came to peacemaking and having difficult conversations?
I would actually say we probably were not the best at it, and some of that had to do with my brother, who I think could pick a fight with a wall when he was growing up, right? And he had to learn those skills. But I also somebody told me something the other day that provided me some really good insight into this. He was asking me about my family life growing up, and he said, that probably contributed to your ability to
Mm,
be able to have more productive conversations and to be more sensitive to what's going on with people around you, because you kind of had to be on the lookout as a child
yeah.
for potential blowups. Now, my family was fine, but with my brother especially, it was always difficult, and I hadn't thought about the fact that that might have been where I learned some of the emotional intelligence involved with trying to be a peacemaker.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good observation. I would say, you only know what you know, right? When you're growing up. And so my family was more like maybe a peacekeeper, like just don't get dad upset or, try to, I was like maybe a classic middle child, but I married into a family where they were like over dinner, they're like throwing stuff at each other. And by dessert, it was just fine. And I would have originally thought that wasn't a healthy dialogue. But what I learned was it's okay to have healthy dialogues doesn't always mean perfectly calm. like are we dealing with it and how do we deal with it in a way? So I don't know, I just thought it's interesting how our family cultures can impact how we look at this.
Yeah, no question. And I think a lot of us learn or don't learn our skills in relation to this through the family dynamic. I think, as you know, I share an anecdote in the book where a friend of mine says something like, "We're all given, if we're parents, we're all given at least one child to help us become more like God." And what he meant by that was like, if you're a parent, you get a kid, and you know that from that child, you're going to learn patience and empathy, and it's not going to be because the child was easy. It's
Right.
going to be because they were a challenge.
Yeah, so true. But I think it depends on who's asking you this, Stephen. But when someone goes, "Hey, Stephen, what do you do?" because you have a very unique job. You actually mentioned this early in the book, but how do you describe what you do for a living?
And the shorthand, I tell people I'm a law professor and a writer. If they actually dig into it, then I tell them, look, I spend a lot of time writing about and talking with people about some of our most complex problems: religious freedom, freedom of speech, academic freedom, campus protests. How do we balance religious freedom interests with things like LGBT plus rights, constitutional law, including things like abortion rights. All those issues are kind of what I do all day, every day, as
Yeah.
many law professors do. But especially being someone who specializes in the First Amendment, a lot of those topics are front and center with my job.
Yeah, it's almost like the kind of conversations people are trying to avoid, and you, yeah, you're walking right into the fire. And I actually admired something you said early in the book that most of them don't go sideways. I mean, a lot of them, when you approach it in a way that you talk about, you can actually have some healthy dialogue. And so you actually practice what you teach here. So I think it's pretty cool. I'm looking forward to actually sharing some of these ideas. But to help us know what you mean by being a peacemaker, let's start with this. What do you not mean when you describe someone as a peacemaker?
Well, one thing I don't mean is someone who avoids having the tough conversations. I also don't mean peacemaker in the sense that we have to solve all of the world's problems, right? We're not going, neither you nor I, no matter how great we are at having productive discourse, are going to achieve peace in the Middle East. So we don't need to feel as if that is our goal.
Mm.
That's not what I mean by being a peacemaker. What I do mean is someone who can have productive dialogue about hard topics, productive discourse about hard topics. That's what I mean by that.
I feel like sometimes the implication, as not in your book for sure, but it's, well, just agree. I don't know really the technical definition of agreeableness as in the Big Five, but I think sometimes people that you just agree with everybody, or don't engage, don't be assertive, have no convictions, or be wishy washy, and that's not at all what you mean, right?
Right, right, exactly. No, it's the ability to talk about things, but to talk about them in a productive way. And sometimes productive means trying to persuade someone to your point of view.
Mm.
But you've got to be able to do that the right way. And if you're just an argumentative jerk, or you're
Yeah.
employing most of the tactics we see on social media or in the comment sections on news sites, you're probably never going to persuade anybody,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The subtitle does a good job of describing what the book is about: habits to change our potentially toxic conversations into healthy dialogues. I just think it's very, very clear. And there's no shortage of potentially toxic conversations these days in culture for sure. But like I said in the intro, even at work. So to understand and apply some of these ideas in the book, I'd love to tee up a potentially challenging work scenario and pass it by. So let's say a listener is leading a team at a company, and that company's decided to put everyone through some diversity training. Okay. And the manager has some team members who have become rather vocal about it. A couple people are deriding it as further evidence of the company going woke with DEI agenda. And most of the others are just kind of keeping quiet, maybe even uncomfortably so. They just don't want to rock the boat. Okay. So during a team meeting, one of the outspoken team members turns to our listener and asks in front of everybody, "So, what do you think about us having to take time away from our work to go through this woke training?" Okay. So let's start with this. What might be a couple examples of how not to respond if we want to be a peacemaker? And then introduce us. Let's start with just the first habit and what that might look like in a situation like this.
Right. So, I mean, I think one of the things not to do in response is to express a really strong opinion one way or the other that you know is going to alienate at least half the people in the room. You've got a topic that you know, whether people are saying it or not, we all know people are about 50-50 divided on this. They have very strong opinions. So if you issue an opinion, you might get 50% of the room who agrees with you, but you're going to divide the other 50%. You're probably not going to get any productive discourse happening. The initial topic, I think, though, or the initial framing of this is one of the things you can do is just say and admit, like, look, I don't know that I know everything about this. I don't know that I know everything about DEI. So my first habit I talk about is developing the trait of intellectual humility.
Mm.
And closely related to that is being able to reframe conversations, right? So I think a good leader is going to take that very hostile, potentially hostile question. I don't think it has to be hostile, but they take a potentially loaded question, and I think they can start off by admitting that they're not quite sure they know everything about the DEI training. DEI comes in many different forms. There's different types of people who do the training. Not all of it is extreme kind of left-wing woke perspectives. Some of it's very middle ground. There are people who take the words diversity, equity, and inclusion and have extreme left-wing meanings to them, but there's other people who don't. And different people can be found among, say, HR departments in large companies. And so as a leader, I'd be curious to know what type of training are we going to get before I really form an opinion on it. And I'd like to see if whatever training we get, I can use it to just be more productive in my time. I think some kind of response like that is going to be much better than just saying, I hate it. And anyone who likes it's an idiot, or
Right.
vice versa, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I was thinking of like, I'm capable of wrong answers on all this stuff here, Steven. So I could see if I think it's stupid too. Like that's not going to work. Or, hey, guys, just keep your head low and your mouth shut. Let's just go through the motions. That's not going to be good, right? That doesn't lead to anything. You used a phrase, I think it was something along the lines of, "Can we turn what could have been a fight into a treasure hunt?" I think you used some terminology that was along those lines. And I just thought that was a really good way of saying it. How can we turn this into a curiosity experiment instead of just another argument? Right?
Right. And I want to emphasize something else that I think it's not habit one, but I think I bring it up in habit two in the book, which is dealing with heuristics
Mhm.
or catchphrases, right? So we
Was
use
in
a
habit
lot of
too, by the way. Yeah.
habit two, right? We
Mhm.
use a lot of slogans in our society and a lot of catchphrases, and chief among them is diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Sure.
Those can be very positive terms. To some people, they can be very negative. One of the things I would say is right out of the gate, and this goes back to the response I would recommend from a leader is I'd really want to know what people in this particular circumstance mean by diversity, equity, and inclusion. I know what the fights are on the internet about it,
Right.
and I know what people who hate it are characterizing it as, but I don't know what kind of training we're going to get here. And I'd like to see how it's going to look before I form an opinion, because I'll tell you, there are probably as many definitions for the words diversity, equity, and inclusion as there are people in the country. And I've met HR folks I've worked with and counseled, gone in and done trainings in companies where the people in charge of the diversity, equity, and inclusion office genuinely mean those terms. Um, to kind of be their best meaning. In other words, they're not applying to them like an extreme left-wing definition to them. They have a very open-minded view about what diversity means, and they want to see diversity of viewpoint. They want to see religious diversity. I've met other people who have very different views of those, but my point is, we don't really know because they're a catchphrase that hasn't been defined well and it's been politicized.
I thought that whole section on heuristics was really helpful because I think we just get so used to them. It's like when you talk about fluency, the more they get said, the more we just kind of get used to it and we stop thinking about what they mean. And it kind of leads to my next question because I think so many things like this, like DEI, politics, social causes, are significantly shaped, maybe more than we realize, by forces that seem to almost conspire against us. Having healthy dialogues. And the second habit is seek real learning. Uh, I know you could give a lecture for many classes on this one, but how do dopamine psychologists, mathematicians, and scientists make it more difficult for us to seek real learning? And then I'm just curious of how you try to seek it personally.
Yeah, so I think most of us know that social media algorithms now are putting us in silos. I'm not sure that's a new, kind of a big surprise to anybody
Yeah.
anymore. But I don't think many of us realize to what extent tech companies, particular smartphone companies and social media companies, have mastered the art of keeping us addicted to our devices. And so, when we get something that gives us pleasure or gets us worked up, it can be either way. Our brains will release a small amount of dopamine to the frontal cortex of our brain. It's how the reward system works. It makes us feel good and excited. We want more of it. These tech companies have hired teams of mathematicians and psychologists whose whole job is to give us steady dopamine hits when we're on our devices or when we're on social media to keep us addicted. And I've got this great quote I found from some mathematician where he says, "Look, math is the tip of my spear, and I know your brain better than you do." I've talked about that to large audiences, and I can always tell people get confused. I don't know what you're talking about, but the reality is they have it down to a mathematical formula as to how often we need to get a notice on our phone or a little ping on social media or the right notice of some news story that they know we're interested in because we paused on something related to it before. And they know exactly when to give us those things to keep us on and to make sure we don't set our devices down. And so what they're doing is they're putting us into these little echo chambers using the mathematics of addiction and the science of addiction to keep us locked in an environment where we really don't hear anything unless it's something we agree with, unless it's something we've already shown interest in. So imagine doing that for months on end and then suddenly having to be exposed to something that you disagree with, being exposed to someone who has a different definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Suddenly you're going to get real worked up because you haven't been training your brain to kind of think about things in different ways.
Yeah. Gambling is not a problem for me, but I often think when I hear somebody gambling, I think they're just messing. The house always wins. How can you fall for that? They know when to let you in, things like that. But I don't think of it when I pick up my phone, Stephen, even though I know exactly what you're saying. I don't think about the fact that they're drawing me in. And even things like how long I waited on something as a show of interest, that is so insidious. And it's
Well,
something,
and
yeah, yeah.
and and I want to emphasize, I'm glad you brought up gambling because the tech industry learned it from the gambling industry. So the gambling industry mastered the mathematics, and scholars have proven there's a ton of research on it. The gambling industry had just teams of mathematicians working on the mathematics for how to keep people addicted in Vegas and other places. And the tech industry and the smartphone industry and social media companies took that same expertise and have now employed it. And I'm not saying this as some big conspiracy. They don't even hide it. It's just the way they're maximizing their profits, and I don't blame them for it. But what we all have to realize is it's not us against our phone.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's if we're trying to kind of free ourselves from the cycle of being addicted to devices and divisive messages and things on our phones, we need to recognize that we're up against teams like departments of psychologists and mathematicians and computer scientists. It's not an easy thing, which means we need to actually put an extra effort to kind of free ourselves from these echo chambers. And if we want to engage in real learning, which is kind of what we're talking about here, we really have to make a concerted effort to seek out and find news sources far beyond what we're being fed, because these teams of psychologists are intentionally feeding us only the things that we want to hear.
Yeah. Do you, you talk about in the book about how you can get your news from, well, like in the US, it'd be, well, I'm going to take some from Fox News. I'm going to take some from MSNBC. Or like I tend to sip a lot of my news off of Wall Street Journal because it feels, although the opinion page can sometimes skew a little right, it does feel to me that you can like and be annoyed by things almost every day in the journal. So I feel like that's a good place to be.
Right,
And so,
right.
you don't have to say the exact sources, but how do you personally kind of navigate the news scene?
Good question. So I actually do not use Fox News and MSNBC. For me, they're a little bit too extreme on both the right and the left. But if you're going to do one, I do think you should do the other to kind of counterbalance it out. For me, it's a combination of three things. I do the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times,
Yeah.
and I like to see for any given topic what each of them is reporting. Because you're right, the Wall Street Journal tends to lean right a little bit. New
Mhm.
York Times tends to lean left, and so I like to balance them out. And then I have, and I mentioned this in the book, I have a lot of scholars and academics and thought leaders that I follow on social media. I tend to know what their biases are.
Mhm.
And I will follow links that specifically I'll search out certain scholars and academics, and I'll follow things that they have indicated are interesting in my field.
Yeah.
That's kind of my third way of doing it. But there are a lot of scholars that I can guarantee if they're sharing something, I know it's going to be
Mhm.
slanted to the left or slanted to the right. And so I go in knowing it. What I don't do, what I have completely avoided, is any type of spoon-fed um, news gathering. On YouTube, on any of my social media feeds, I seek it out. I don't just take what the computer's giving me.
Yeah, I like it. And something else I appreciate what you had, I think it was in that section was, because you did not have a call for like throw your phone in the lake. It wasn't any of that. But sometimes when we do unhook, it can feel boring. But the reason why it feels boring is we're not getting the dopamine hits, and recognize that lack of dopamine there might actually be a good thing, right? I never really kind of thought of it that way, but I seem to recall that was part of your discussion, right?
Yes. I mean, look, the reality is if you try to disconnect from your phone, you're going to go through some kind of withdrawal symptoms, right? It's going to be hard.
Yeah.
Um, I was talking about this up to an audience in Canada, and I was having the audience brainstorm. Well, what are some ways we can get off our devices and actually engage in real learning? And I liked what one lady in the audience said that I now wish I had put in the book. I think I did in a, indirectly, but she hit it right on the nose. She said, "Look, when you're trying to stop something you're addicted to, and you're trying to get over an addiction, it's not enough to simply stop. You have to replace it with something else." And that was key, replacing it with something else. So my recommendation is don't get off the phone and then just sit there and sink into a depression because your body is no longer getting the dopamine hits it needs. Engage in long form reading, get out into the world, explore, go on hikes, biking, anything that you can find that you enjoy. I think what you're going to find is that you'll actually be a lot happier and in a much better place than just getting the kind of all night long dopamine hits from looking at your phone and waiting for the next little notice to pop up that gets you excited.
Absolutely. To introduce your third habit of a peacemaker, and I promise we won't go through all of them because I want people to get the book, but let's try a different scenario. A CIO told me that the biggest concern he had about his direct reports is that when they get some pushback from other parts of the business, these direct reports, who are highly seasoned people, they lose their poise. And so they get defensive. So let's say one of those direct reports is trying to get buy-in from the business, maybe to fund a major initiative, and the business is pushing back hard with comments like, "You IT people, you just don't get it. You can't keep our existing technology from breaking down, and now you want to throw more at us. There's no way I'm funding more disruption." So there's all kinds of reasons why it might be challenging to exercise habit 3 here, to assume the best about people when it feels like they're almost like insulting us. So tell us more about this habit and how we might be able to exercise it when it almost feels like we're being attacked.
Sure. Well, I mean, 90% of the time when we feel like we're being attacked, it's actually it's more us projecting onto the people who are talking to us. What you just described is a pretty blatant
Mhm.
attack, but lots of times we tend to uh, we tend to create these thought distortions about the world around us and assume people are attacking us when they're not. Far better uh, to us to try to assume in every scenario that someone has a possibly positive motive for what they're doing, right? We send something over to someone, they come back and they say, "There's no way we can do this. It's ridiculous." Well, that's not an artful way of expressing it, but let's stop and pause for a minute and ask, what are they worried about? Do they got someone breathing down their neck and they're worried about budget concerns? What are their underlying concerns in their position um, that is causing them to be this stressed about this? And can we have a conversation about those underlying concerns rather than come back and say, "You're an idiot. We need this."
Mhm.
Far better to come in and say, "Well, what are you worried about? What do we think we can't achieve here?" And try to figure out what's motivating people beneath the surface. I think too often we have this natural instinct to assume that people are acting from the worst motives. I think more often than not, people are actually acting from pretty reasonable motives. And the key is to ask questions to figure out what those motives are. But the habit we have to engage in is to reframe the thought distortions in our minds when we assume people are acting badly, to look at the situation and ask ourselves, could there be something else that's motivating this person besides my assumption that they're acting out of bad motives? Now, don't get me wrong, there are bad actors in the world,
Yeah.
and there are people who would stab us in the back if they could. But I think more often than not, especially in a work environment, lots of people are motivated by a lot of different things. And I wouldn't start with the assumption that everyone you're dealing with is a bad actor. Generally speaking, people have got at least reasonable reasons. And the question is, can you figure out what those are and then perhaps persuade them because you've taken the time to do that?
I remember a boss said something along the lines of, everyone's behavior is rational to them. And so even if it doesn't seem rational to us, it is to them. So, like you say, if we can kind of dig in and uh, I don't remember which guest it was, but they said something like, avoid the BSL narrative, bad, stupid, and lazy. When we start thinking of people as they're bad, stupid, or lazy, that should be the trigger. And you said it, I thought you said it in a clever way. Is something like, we sometimes assume there are people who agree with us, fascists and fools, or something, something like that.
Right.
We just are too apt maybe to write these people off instead of, wait, what's behind this? Right? So
Right.
it's a
Right.
bit, yeah.
And one of the challenges is people struggle to express what their underlying concerns are very well, right? So the person who comes in and rejects your project, or they're angry that you're spending too much time on something, might not do it in the most artful way.
Yeah.
So one thing we've got to work on is first figuring out what could be motivating them, and then take whatever comments they give us and reframe them in their best light.
Mhm.
So we say, all right, what this person really means is we've got budget constraints, and I'm worried this is going to go over budget and we can't afford it. So I'm going to rephrase it back to him in that way, and then we'll have a conversation about that. And it's so it requires you, of course, then to really think what about other motivations people might have, and then be willing to reframe their comments in that light, and not get upset when they're not the best and most artful at framing their own concerns.
Yeah. Stephen, honestly, I think sometimes when people push back on me and I want to write them off, there's truth to what they're saying. So, like, maybe our IT department has been dropping the ball recently. And instead of getting defensive, say, the truth is we have had some support issues. And that has, I mean, almost like instead of pushing back, it's actually finding ways to agree with them. That's a theme in your book, too. Like, can we find ways to share a common issue there instead of getting defensive? So, I don't know. There's,
Well, and can you get after the same root concern, right? If
right.
someone comes, I keep using the example of someone worried about budget, but they come back, they say, look, we can't do this project because of budget concerns. You finally figure that out.
Yeah.
Well, then you can have a conversation about where can we address the budget concerns somewhere else. You can say, look, we really need this. We really need this particular IT product we're pushing out here. But you know where we could cut? We could cut this other one that I've been working on. Something like that. You start addressing their concerns, and that's the productive part of productive discourse that I'm talking about. You've hit the underlying concern, and then together you start brainstorming, how do we solve the actual problem? And
Yeah.
usually what happens is the other person probably calm down a little bit. Not always, right? But they'll start to calm down a little bit, and they'll start problem solving with you. And that's where we get to what you mentioned earlier, where it changes from a conflict to a treasure hunt. We're trying to figure out how to solve the budget problem together.
Yeah, I get. Let's say there's a holiday coming up, and a listener knows they're going to be at some family gathering, and that has an uncle who has significantly different political views, and our listener's already dreading hearing about the uncle's rants about what's wrong in the world and how their candidate or political party is the answer, and others are idiots. And past family gatherings have resulted in raised voices and, even if quiet, raised blood pressure. So in Habit 4, you provide some ideas on how to control our emotions. And so, how do you like to describe Habit 4? And can you think of any ways that you personally try to control your emotions when you're in situations like this?
One of the absolute best skills, I have to confess, I have been blessed to not be the most emotional person in the world. I don't feel emotions so deeply that I have a hard time controlling them, and I don't think everyone has that just natural state.
Yeah.
So that's easier for me. But nevertheless, I do feel emotions, and I do get worked up about things. And the question is, how do you deal with them?
Yeah.
You know, One thing that I have found to be incredibly useful is the lost art of journaling,
Mhm.
and in particular, spending time, writing about your emotions, writing about things that get you upset, writing about your thought distortions. So you might think to yourself, I got this uncle coming. This guy is the world's worst jerk. I don't want to be around him. I hate this. So
Right.
it's 2 days ahead of time, right?
Yeah.
Well, maybe spending some time, if you stay in that state of mind, it's probably not going to go well at Thanksgiving, but maybe you sit down and you write in your journal, this guy is the world's worst jerk. And then you start writing down all of the evidence for that thought and all of the evidence against it. I think what you're probably going to find is your uncle might be actually a really decent guy, takes care of his family, cares about you, cares about his parents, is a decent person, whatever. You might find all these things. I mean, look, there are monsters in the world, but let's assume there's a reason you're sitting with this guy at Thanksgiving. So
Right.
you're going to start to realize that he probably has a lot of redeeming qualities. The one that drives you crazy is that he's really opinionated and likes to go off on his politics. And then you can say, okay, he's a good guy. Maybe I can just be patient and listen to him. Maybe I don't have to express my opinions and argue with him, but can just ask him questions about why he thinks what he thinks, or what he thinks the outcomes will be, without me arguing. I think the journaling in advance is a great way to control your emotions before you get to the situation, and you'll be ready for it when it happens. And you can do that, by the way, with in your job and work and leadership, right? If you know you've got a difficult situation coming, or if you're highly paranoid about somebody and you think they're out to get you, writing down your thoughts and then writing all the evidence for and against them helps you think through uh, your thought distortions. We call it metacognition, and the idea is you're getting outside of your own head and you're looking at it as you would if you were talking with someone else and advising them. Have you ever noticed how when somebody comes to you with a problem, you can give them all sorts of wonderful advice, but then you can't give the same advice to yourself?
Yeah.
This act of journaling like this and practicing metacognition helps you kind of achieve that and prepares you for the difficult conversations you know are coming.
Yeah. You know, I feel like if you would have asked me for a definition of gaslighting before I read your book, I'm not sure I could have given you a good one, although you hear it all the time, especially in political context. So I'm not sure we're all on the same page with that. So, how would you describe what gaslighting is, and how can that show up in difficult conversations outside of politics?
Right. So the example, so gaslighting comes from a play that was written where there was a husband who wanted to mess with his wife. He was trying to, take her inheritance essentially. And this was back when you had gas lights in homes, and he was slowly messing with the lights to make them way dimmer, brighter, dimmer again. And he was doing it so slowly that she didn't realize what was happening. She would say things like, "It seems darker in here." He said, "Oh, you're just imagining it, right?" So he's making her question her reality. Gaslighting is that term has advanced over the last 100 years or whatever. But what it means now is when someone engages in conversation tactics that make us kind of change the topic and question our reality. So the example I give in my book is, a parent comes in and tells their 12-year-old, "Hey, you need to go clear the table," and the 12-year-old says, "Why are you always yelling at me?" Well, that's the first step in gaslighting. If the parent responds and says, "I'm not yelling at you," you're no longer having a conversation about the original topic. You're not talking about whether or not the 12-year-old needs to do the chore of clearing the table. What you're talking about is whether or not the parent is yelling. And a really good gaslighter, will always just keep moving the topic. So the parent says, "Well, I'm not yelling at you." And the daughter will say, "Yes, you are. You were yelling at me this morning too." "I wasn't yelling at you this morning. We went to breakfast." Suddenly you're 2 degrees away from the topic. And if you keep going, you could be 10 conversation points away. And at the end, the parent walks out of the room thinking, maybe I am always yelling at my kid, or they're probably thinking about something 10 topics away from that. What gets completely lost is the original topic. People who are gaslighters often do this unintentionally,
Mm.
but it's a really good deflection. It's a really good way of deflecting a conversation from having to deal with the topic at hand. So what you've got to do is you've got to take a step back and recognize if someone's doing it to you. And you really got to ask in the moment, is this retort back directly on point, or have they shifted the topic a little bit? And if they've shifted the topic, then you've got to politely say, "Look, we can talk about that another time. I want to circle back and talk about this question of, are you going to clear the table tonight? That's all we're talking about." And it's not easy to do. It's not easy to identify, but you can do it. First time I learned about that, it was with one of my children.
Yeah.
And as soon as I realized he was doing it to me and I called him out on it, it was a game changer.
But didn't
So
he even fess up later on? He goes, "All right, Dad, I really was changing the subject."
yeah. But he said, he told me, he said, I wasn't doing it on purpose. It wasn't a
Wow.
conscious thing. For him, it was just, I think it's a natural human instinct for many people. It's how we argue with each other. But he told me when I started calling him out on it, he said, "Yeah, Dad, it's exactly what I was doing, but I wasn't doing it on purpose. It's just, that was my instinct to move it, to keep shifting it."
Yeah, yeah. Well, actually, that kind of gets to my last question because there's so many things, Stephen, I'd love to talk to you about. But let's just end with this one. We have a lot of parents who listen to the podcast, and this stuff applies at home just as much. Can you think of some ways that you and your wife seek to apply some of these habits actually at home?
I'll go back if I could to the very first habit of this intellectual humility. It's really easy to be judgmental of other people. It's easy to be judged. Grandparents say we'll come visit a home. They'll be there one day out of a year, observe the house, and then jump to all sorts of conclusions about how the parenting is going, right? But if you stop and think about it, they're seeing less than 0.5% of what's going on in that home. They're seeing even less of what's going on in people's minds in the home. We know so little about each other and about what's happening in our lives that just remembering that can be really useful when it comes to not being judgmental, not making negative comments towards one another in the family environment. Um, as parents of teenagers, we might see a teenager doing something and think, "Oh, she's being the most, or he or she's being the most rebellious kid ever." But if you really start to talk to them, you realize they're not being rebellious at all. They might just be clueless. What you interpreted as being rebellious may have just been you're misinterpreting the situation. So, always remembering how little we know about a situation and trying to learn more about it, I think, can be incredibly useful in the home. Children, I would tell you, just another habit to use. We talked about gaslighting. I think children are masters of gaslighting. That's not just politicians. It is a natural thing kids do. And so, as a parent, you always have to keep that voice calm and not allow them to shift the topic of the conversation. Um, all of these things I think can be really useful in that real learning, long form reading and study about parenting techniques and how to do it can be incredibly useful. So these are all habits that I think can be useful. They can be useful in work. They can be useful in talking about politics, useful in family relationships. And I think they can help us all make the world a little bit better place. Do you mind? I'm going on too long, but do you mind if I say one more thing?
Oh, please do. I'm loving every bit of this.
The assuming the best about people. Where I first started employing that habit before I actually did research into it was when my wife and I got married. She said, I want to have a, I don't know where she got this from. It's brilliant. She said, I want to have a marriage where we always assume that the other one is acting for a good reason and not assume when they do something that it's for a bad reason. I can't tell you how many fights that has probably saved us from, because when either of us see the other one doing something that, we might find irksome,
Yeah.
we always tell ourselves, what could be a good reason they're doing that? And you know what? 99 out of 100 times, they almost always have a good reason for why they were doing something. It has saved so much conflict in our marriage and in our home, just that practice alone of assuming the best about people.
Oh, that's so good. For those listening, you've just gotten a small taste. I mean, we barely touched the surface of what's included in Stephen's book. I personally consider this to be a must read book. Get a copy of Habits of a Peacemaker. I put links to the book and Stephen's website in the show notes for this cast. So, Stephen, thank you so much for joining us on the People and Projects podcast.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.